The Project Aurora leak. Did a senior engineer just prove back-engineered alien tech? It spun with no fuel, he whispers, eyes on a folder stamped Project Aurora. On the top page, a redacted schematic, a ringed core annotated ZPF coupling. Performance notes that read like fiction, right-angle jumps, silent climb, pilot exposure limits blacked out. An internal memo says non-terrestrial derivation, underlined twice. If this is real, it rewrites energy, war, and who decides the future. Aurora's been a rumor, a ghost jet, a budget sink. This leak is different, specs, logs, procurement. One component name, Hermes, shows up in 3 separate decades. To understand why the memo reads like panic, we go back to the first anomaly. The first anomaly, desert test that shouldn't have worked. They called it a range calibration, the kind you run when nobody's career is on the line. But that morning the project manager wore the expression of a man betting a house deed. The device sat on a ceramic pedestal inside a corrugated shelter, cables snaked to a rack of oscilloscopes and a portable cryo unit coughing vapor into the desert heat. No jet fuel, no oxidizer, no propellant tanks. Just a ring, layered metal and coils, tethered to a power bus drawing less than a household hairdryer. Stakes were unspoken, but everyone felt them. The program had burned 2 fiscal years and left a trail of skeptical auditors. One silent spin-up could save jobs, contracts, and reputations. One hiccup could bury it in the interesting, not actionable graveyard. The range commander had cleared a wide box of airspace anyway. You don't risk a telemetry bird for an interesting test. At 3:11, the tech chief gave a thumbs up. The engineer will meet later, still anonymous in the logs, typed in a frequency sweep and paused. He wrote in his pocket notebook, "If it hums, we're not alone." They brought the core to pre-cool, the cryo unit ticking down. A faint frosting formed at the base, a little halo where nothing should frost in that dry air. The comms net crackled. Someone chuckled about ghost air conditioning. The project manager didn't smile. Stakes, a program lives or dies on what happens next. The order was simple, 10-second resonance ramp, hold then off. The action wasn't. At 3 hours 14 minutes and 26 seconds, the ring started to sing, barely audible, a thin glassy tone inside a higher frequency hiss, like pressure equalizing inside the skull. The range microphones recorded a sound that later analysts described as EM pickup masquerading as audio. The unit lifted. Not much, 2 inches, maybe 3, hovering on its pedestal as if a hand were under it, steady as a bubble in thick oil. Everything in the room responded before anyone did. Breath condensed at the ring edge. A wool cap on the back of a chair pressed flat. Paper clips oriented like compass needles. Temperature probes along the housing registered a dip, fractional but consistent. And inexplicably, the bus power draw dropped as the lift stabilized. The graph shows it, a shallow U-shaped sag in consumption at the moment the device cleared the pedestal. Less in than out, at least by the range recordings account. The technician nearest the device wrote later, ozone and metal taste. He rubbed his tongue with the back of his glove, a reflex he couldn't explain. The comms net didn't like what it heard. Packets stuttered, voice cut to syllables, and the range commander's request for a second camera angle turned into a burst of static. Headaches bloomed, a cluster of people pressing fingers to temples, squinting like the air itself had gotten too bright. Meanwhile at the rack, the engineer, our future whistleblower, gripped the edge and breathed through his teeth. He'd been told the equations predicted mass fluctuation. A polite way of saying inertia and weight might not be as stubborn as we think. Seeing the ring float with a power dip wasn't a theoretical curve. It was a rebuke to everything he'd been taught to rule out. He scribbled 2 words in the margin of a printed diagram. Phase cancel inertia. This was the moment everything changed. The project manager cut the hold short. Down now. 10 seconds became 5. The ring settled with a soft click, the tone faded, the cold halo retreated. Comms came back in a blink, as if a switch had flipped somewhere above the building. The oscilloscope traces, if you believe the logs, kept dancing for a few seconds more, like an echo in a canyon you can't see. In the aftermath, the official report called it a sensor error. The range cameras were out of calibration. The microphones picked up electromagnetic interference. The power bus measurement subject to drift. The section that mentioned lift used the phrase, apparent separation. A memo appended the next day reclassified all raw files and noted distribution, program office only. On paper, the test underperformed and did not meet objectives. What nobody knew at the time, unless they were watching Procurement, was that the supply chain moved like someone had greenlit a miracle. Within 2 weeks, requisitions spiked for barium ferrite composites, niobium titanium wire, high-purity bismuth slices, and a curious spec for layered metal sheets at micron-scale tolerances. Those orders didn't go to the usual catalog vendors. They clustered around 3 shell companies tied to a single P.O. box in a city that doesn't brag about its defense work. Hidden in the materials list was a breadcrumb, a codename attached to a purchase order for a ring liner, Metamaterial, MK2. Hermes. It wasn't a working group, not a deliverable anyone on the range had heard. It was a tag that would show up again years later in an unrelated ocean sensor log and decades before in a metallurgical note clipped into a 1950s archive. Hermes wasn't a person or a place. It was a bridge. Human moments linger. The tech who wrote about the taste of metal reported nosebleeds that week. The range commander filed a noise complaint with himself, an acoustic signature he couldn't place, then moved it to closed. The project manager gathered the team and told them the word nobody wanted to hear: silence. We'll treat anomalies as instrumentation issues until validation. The engineer stayed after the meeting, staring at the pedestal. He put his hand where the ring had been. It felt like a refrigerator door left open a crack. Impact rippled inside compartments. Budgets that had been in limbo crossed signatures overnight. A visiting auditor was rescheduled, then reassigned. A redacted email hints at a new hazard classification. Pilot exposure limits, deferred pending CR. The rest blacked out, the fragment enough to suggest they were talking about something you don't measure with a Geiger counter. While the range buried it in paperwork, aerospace suppliers started moving like they'd been waiting for the call. The anomaly had a supply chain, and the supply chain had a story to tell. Paper trail, the procurement that gave it away. While the range filed instrumentation error, the money told a louder truth. On paper, it looked like gaskets, fasteners, thermal paste, boring. But buried in the line items were orders that didn't belong together outside a very specific kind of machine. Barium ferrite composites in odd aspect ratios. Bulk niobium titanium wire spooled to cryo-rated tolerances. High-purity bismuth sliced into sheets thinner than a human hair. And a layered metal specification that repeated like a drumbeat. Alternating bismuth and magnesium zinc, micron scale, edge polished, vacuum bag sealed. Stakes moved from career risk to something bigger. Billions pushed through innocuous codes, the kind that never draw a hearing. Oversight sleeps when everything reads like office supplies. The first unusual cluster hit a small vendor network nobody had heard of. 3 LLCs formed within days of each other, each registered to the same P.O. box above a shuttered photocopy shop. Their contracts ballooned from 5 figures to 8 in under a quarter. Action starts with a spreadsheet and a set of curious eyes. A mid-level accountant in a defense finance office flagged a pattern. The same layered metal spec appearing under different commodity codes, routed through 3 primes that never bid publicly. She wrote an internal note, repeat spec, cross-year, cross-office, unexplained, and sent it up. 2 days later, she was reassigned to special projects. Her final email auto-replied for months. On extended TDY. Evidence had a rhythm. Purchase orders referencing ring liner, metamaterial, MK2 Hermes. Freight bills showing refrigerated transport for non-biological goods. Anodized housings delivered with cryo-compatible bushings. A one-time lump sum for sensor shielding arrays. Cross-reference to a vendor known for high-frequency waveguides, not shields. The invoices stacked, bland and reassuring, until you traced the ship-to addresses, contractor depots proximate to test ranges, and one inland facility with a runway nobody uses publicly. The materials weren't random. Barium ferrite for magnetic behavior at radio frequencies. Niobium titanium for superconducting coils when you cool them hard enough. Bismuth for geomagnetism and odd thermal conduction. Magnesium zinc to play well with the bismuth without poisoning the bond. The repeated spec called for alternating layers measured in microns, a composite that showed up in fringe stories from the 1990s about crash retrieval fragments. Those stories were easy to laugh off, until the exact stack appeared in a Navy shipping manifest labeled Prototype Internal. Human moments leak through ledgers. A supplier rep joked in a bar about the thinnest lasagna you've ever seen, then clammed up when someone asked which kitchen. A quality control tech signed off on a lot with a note, optical shimmer under T-Hertz lamp, and got his wrist slapped for adding commentary. A driver hauled a sealed crate under temperature control in midsummer and Told his wife he'd never felt cold seep through steel. Impact rolled through the market. Prices for high-purity bismuth ticked up quietly. A single refinery began quoting defense preference lead times. A magnesium mill took a contract that made no sense for its public portfolio, then posted a job listing for a metallurgist with thin film deposition experience at a facility that didn't advertise clean rooms. Meanwhile, a cryo vendor doubled capacity and won a classified award that came with non-disclosure training for forklift operators. What nobody outside the compartment saw was the way contracts nested. The Shell LLCs fed subassemblies to a mid-tier aerospace firm that specialized in integrated quiet power. That firm had just acquired a materials lab with Lineage to a 195's Air Force research unit. In their marketing archive, a forgotten brochure bragged about magnesium-bismuth interface stability, language that reappeared in a 21st century vendor spec, sentence for sentence, with the adjectives swapped for acronyms. Complications surfaced because perfect systems don't exist. One procurement drew a question from a contracting officer about the unusual combination of cryo parts and high-frequency shielding. The answer came back with a waiver. Program-specific integration, SAP reference on file. Another requisition used a code typically reserved for medical equipment to move a pallet of niobium titanium. The paperwork said MRI spare, but the receiving base had no hospital. Meanwhile, parallel buys hinted at the control headache they were fighting. Orders for optical isolators and fiber links rated for kilovolt transients. EMI gaskets in quantities that made no sense unless electronics were dying regularly. A small run of operator mitigation apparel, cryptic until you read the return notes, size exchange, pilot. This was the moment everything changed for those watching the trail. The layered metal spec matched descriptions from a controversial set of samples that had floated around journalists and labs for decades. Micron-thin bismuth alternating with magnesium zinc. Scientists had argued over their origin, many concluding they were interesting but not alien. The point wasn't proving provenance. It was that a classified program was buying their way into that geometry, at scale, with precision no garage could hit. The accountant who'd been reassigned kept notes anyway. She circled Hermes wherever it appeared, on packing slips, on internal memos, on a firmware compliance checklist she wasn't supposed to see. Hermes traveled with the ring. It showed up in a line item for phase array coil windings, Rev C, and again in a cryptic request for Cerulean lock parameter update, Propulsion team. The supply chain, all on its own, whispered that the desert drive had cousins in water. Impact settled into a shape, a quiet retooling of vendors across 3 states, a bottleneck in bismuth purity, a new class of secrecy briefings at companies that used to make airframes, not fields. Oversight committees read smooth summaries and nodded. The line items didn't sing. They only sang if you'd heard the hum. And for one engineer who had, there was nothing abstract about bismuth and wire. He'd felt the pedestal cold and watched the power dip. The paper trail didn't prove the lift. It proved intent. It proved persistence. It proved someone was building a machine around an impossible idea and buying the pieces to run it again. The senior engineer, why he broke. He wasn't a romantic about physics. He was an integrator, wires, firmware, tolerances. 30 years in aerospace, the kind of person programs trust when the theory stops and the soldering iron starts. He'd come up on turbine blades and switched to fields because the money moved. Pension in sight, kids through college, a house with a mortgage he could see the end of. Then the ring hummed, and the math he'd filed under maybe someday walked into his ear and sat there. Stakes were simple and brutal. Keep quiet and keep everything, or speak and risk all of it. He told himself he was just documenting a discrepancy. During an internal review, he wrote in the comment field, observed effective energy out in under lift condition, anomalous inertia reduction suspected. He knew how that would read. He sent it anyway. In the meeting, a colleague snorted. You forgot the minus sign. Another laughed, tapped the whiteboard. Error stack, not free energy. He didn't push back. He nodded, pretended relief, and went back to his bench. But he kept a second notebook. In the margins of a photocopied schematic, he scribbled the phrase that had hit him at the rack. Phase cancel inertia. Not as a declaration, as a question. What if the field geometry did to inertia what noise-canceling headphones do to sound? He annotated coil windings, circled the bismuth magnesium stack, drew an arrow to a block labeled Hermes and wrote, timing key? It wasn't a manifesto. It was a working man. trying to reconcile a cold pedestal with a power dip. At 3 a.m. on a maintenance window, he was assigned to firmware verification. The building was quieter than any lab should be. No clanks, no forklifts, just the buzz of lights and the soft hiss from the cryo lines. He clicked through a menu he knew by muscle memory and watched the unit pre-warm to a test state. The hum arrived before the numbers moved, a thin, dental drill thread that made the hair on his arms lift. He wrote one line in his notebook. "This can't be human." He meant the feeling, not the lineage. The feeling that the room had been retuned, like walking into a church after Mass and hearing a note still hanging. He raised the moment in an engineering review the following week. "We're not losing power to drift. The bus drops in sync with lift." The program physicist slid the printouts across the table, the official ones that flattened curves into compliance. "Your instrument is lying." The manager added, "We don't use language that invites outside review." He knew what that meant. He also knew the procurement he wasn't supposed to see had ordered more of the exact layered metal he'd just traced with his finger. If it was a lie, they were buying more of it. The response came fast. He was pulled off integration, assigned to documentation. His NDA refresher felt different. No jokes, no eye rolls. A security officer, he'd never met read clauses that weren't in his first packet. He found his name missing from a distribution list he'd been on for years. HR called it role realignment. In the hangar, people who used to talk shop with him switched to weather. He pushed down the anger because anger is loud and loud is dangerous. Then came the memo. Not addressed to him, but routed through his new inbox by mistake. An internal note linking Project Aurora. Hermes integration to legacy alloy sample analysis, 1954. He froze. The attachment field referenced a file number in a lab, Wright-Patterson. He'd heard the stories like everyone, filed them under folklore. Seeing a program code he knew paired with a year, he didn't undone his compartmentalization. He printed the page, read it once, and slid it under his keyboard. He didn't take copies home. He wasn't reckless. He just didn't let this one disappear. Human cost crept in sideways. His wife said he'd started waking up at 3:14, the time stamped on the test video, staring at the ceiling. He stopped taking the motorcycle on Fridays. He began running quiet errands he didn't used to, like buying a second phone and then not using it. In the lab, he leaned a little too long near the ring when it idled, and came back with a headache he pretended was dehydration. He wrote pilot exposure limits in his notebook and underlined it twice. Why he broke wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation, the downgrade after asking a fair question, the way procurement sang the same note as the hum. The memo that took him from this decade to a sample labeled with a year that belonged to his father. He'd spent a career building the things other people imagined. Now he was being asked to pretend he hadn't seen a thing his hands could still feel. He made a small decision first: keep that memo. He'd justify it as a misfiled document he'd return later. He didn't return it. That choice forced the next. The memo forced us decades back. 1954 sample, the origin myth of the alloy. To understand the memo that froze him, we need to step into a basement lab when the Cold War was still learning to walk. The folder was stamped Foreign Recoveries, in a font that looks quaint now. Inside, a lab intake sheet dated 1954, routed to Wright-Patterson's materials unit, assigned to a project officer whose name appears only as initials. The object arrived in a foam-lined tin with a typed tag, Sample 72B. Provenance was a paragraph of fog, field collection, Western Range, high security chain, written to say something while telling nothing. Stakes weren't academic. Whoever could bend new physics would own the century. The Air Force had a simple directive: get smarter faster. 72B was small, a shard barely larger than a postage stamp, but it didn't behave like scrap. Under a jeweler's loupe it showed stripes, not from machining, but from nature faking a laminate. A technician sketched it with a pencil, shading the dark bands thicker. He labeled one side MGZN, with a question mark that lingered for years. Action lived in the tests. Metallurgists sliced a sliver with a diamond saw, floated it in alcohol, and measured layer thickness with an optical comparator. The report notes microns, not mils, bismuth in layers as thin as paper ash, alternating with thicker magnesium zinc. They tried to melt the interface and failed. It beaded like oil on glass. Isotope ratios looked wrong. Not extraterrestrial, just skewed enough to suggest an unusual process. The stack refused to diffuse at temperatures that should have blurred it. Someone wrote quasi-ordered. In the margin, an early stab at a word that would later be called metamaterial. Evidence stacked up in dry lines. Anisotropic response under T-Hertz lamp exposure. Diamagnetic enhancement beyond bulk bismuth. Thermal gradient across thickness not explained by conductivity tables. They brought magnets near the shard and saw behavior that made no sense in a classroom. The field lines bent in a way the chalkboard never warned about. A lab tech wrote a note that doesn't belong in a government file. Coffee cup skittered when magnet approached 72B, hands steady. He underlined cup. Meanwhile, a cooler detail, the shard pulled heat like it was thirsty. One probe near a bismuth layer recorded a small, repeatable dip when driven with a radio frequency coil. The delta was tiny fractions of a degree, but consistent enough that a skeptical supervisor ordered a second rig. The second rig echoed the first. The write-up called it a local thermal anomaly under EM excitation. Nobody used words like field coupling. That language comes with decades. They settled for anomaly. This was the moment everything changed for the file, not for the world. A senior scientist summarized, "Not manufacturable with current processes." The phrase appears twice, once in the conclusion, and once in a routing slip to an office whose number now maps to a building with no public entrance. The recommendation: store under exotic, restrict distribution, revisit when techniques improve. They wrapped the shard in fresh foil and slid it into a labeled drawer with a key that lived on a chain under a shirt. What nobody outside the room knew was that a name in the report's CC list would echo 60 years later. The initials matched the surname that rides along the Aurora procurement lineage, a through line from a mid-century materials lab to a modern contractor with a sanitized logo. The scientist wasn't immortal. People don't live that long. But their students do, and their papers seed families of companies. The CC list reads like a family tree if you know how to squint at titles. Human moments didn't stop. A junior chemist took the bus home that week and told her husband, "We had a piece of something today that behaved like a trick." She couldn't say more. A machinist refused to clamp the shard with standard jaws and built soft fixtures at lunch because he didn't like the sound it made under pressure. Another tech stopped wearing his wedding ring near the magnet bench after it tingled his finger when 72B was present. There's no equation for tingling, but he logged it anyway. Impact was a shelf, not a breakthrough. The memo that closed the file wasn't defeatist, it was cautious. Indexed under EX4. Pending process advances. Translation: we can't copy it yet, so we won't talk about it. But they kept sniffing the edges. 2 years later, a proposal floated to deposit thin bismuth on magnesium via sputter. It died for lack of vacuum gear. A decade after that, a different team tried electroplating and produced a crumbling parody of the original. None of it matched 72, BS neat, stubborn order. Complications multiplied where knowledge runs ahead of tooling. One test chamber picked up an electromagnetic hum on microphones when the shard was driven at a specific frequency. The report waved it away as pickup. The number next to the hum looks familiar now. It sits close to the resonance scribbled years later on a leaked diagram. Back then it was noise. Today it's a breadcrumb. The alloy waited. The Cold War churned. People retired, died, were remembered with plaques that didn't mention drawers. The samples label browned at the corners. A notes clerk moved the paper file into a newer folder with the same stamp and added a routing code that would someday be called Hermes. When the engineer in our story read that memo headlined 1954 sample, he wasn't seeing myth. He was seeing continuity. The shard didn't prove aliens. It proved that in 1954, someone put a piece of layered bismuth and magnesium on a bench, watched magnets misbehave, felt heat move the wrong way, and admitted they couldn't make it. The alloy sat there, quiet, waiting for the math and the machines to catch up. The physics bridge, from fringe to bench. To understand how a drawer labeled EX4 became a ring that hummed, we have to follow an idea that wouldn't stay dead. The engineer's margin note, phase cancel inertia, has a paper ancestry. It starts where respectable journals graze the fence line. Mass fluctuation, field-induced inertia modulation, vacuum polarization as engineering variable. The words changed with decades, but the itch stayed the same. Could you make inertia negotiable? Stakes were reputations. Careers wilt when you say vacuum energy too loudly. Yet a small cluster of researchers kept threading the needle, translating daring claims into cautious math. A constant began to repeat in their work like a watermark, showing up in integrals tied to oscillating electromagnetic fields. then reappearing under a different name in a defense-funded preprint. If you lay those papers side by side, the symbols change fonts, but the ratio tucked inside the equations doesn't move much. That number will surface again in a leaked schematic annotation and in a 1954 note that called a hum pickup. The action started with rediscoveries. In conference side rooms, someone always had a slide on mass oscillation and inertia reduction if boundary conditions were just right. The mainstream called it Fringe. Meanwhile, agencies wrote innocuous grant titles: Materials Response under High-Frequency Fields, Non-Propulsive Field Dynamics, Precision Coil Timing. Footnotes thanked anonymous sponsors. The review panels didn't fight if the math behaved, and the claims stayed small. The labs built rigs that weren't meant to be prototypes, just tests you could publish without sinking your tenure. Evidence accumulated as echoes. A patent application for an electromagnetic field generator framed as asteroid deflection talked about coupling to the vacuum state, polarizing the local medium. Another patent on inertial mass reduction sketched a resonant cavity and microwaves. You can dismiss patents as ideas on paper, but they reveal what a bureaucracy will swear is plausible, at least enough to file, defend, and fund. Around the same time, a handful of academic articles explored rotating electromagnetic fields interacting with structured materials, metamaterials, predicting unusual index behavior at specific bands. The odd constant kept peeking from the derivations like a shy witness. Human moments tell you who was listening. A professor who'd made his name in a safer corner of electromagnetics agreed to brief a group that never meets on campus. Over coffee, off record, he said they wanted null gravity without thrust. He didn't mean anti-gravity. He meant reducing the felt inertia so motion didn't punish a body. He sketched a ring, not unlike our desert core, and an array of coils timed to chase a resonance most people never look for. Then he stopped, laughed, and changed the subject to antenna design. This was the moment everything changed for the math. After 2004, when pilots started reporting objects moving like inertia had been bargained down, a quiet surge of funding pushed theory toward hardware. Papers that once used toy models started including material parameters you could order: permeability, permittivity, loss tangents at kilohertz to megahertz bands. A few papers buried references to bismuth's diamagnetism and magnesium's compatibility in layered stacks under thermal cycling. Nobody wrote 72B, but the fingerprints were there. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Grants for precision field timing architectures funded FPGA work that doesn't look like physics from the outside. It looks like digital plumbing. But phase control at microsecond scales is how you make fields interfere the way you want, where you want. A constant appearing in the control code, call it a phase step tied to a resonance near 230 kilohertz, matches a number scribbled on a leaked diagram margin and sits not far from a 1954 microphone hum. Separate lanes converging. Impact showed up as prototypes cloaked in materials testbeds. A black budget lab can call a drive a bench rig if you keep the scope local. A study on thermal anomalies under high-frequency excitation folded into a report on field-structured composites. A memo justified a jump in funding after post-2004 incidents raised interest in non-kinetic maneuvering. Theoretical curves became target requirements. The ring in the desert wasn't born from a eureka. It was the child of careful boundary conditions married to stubborn layering no one could do in 1954. Complications never left. Skeptics pointed out that vacuum polarization is a minefield and that patents don't prove feasibility. The bridge didn't need believers. It needed tolerances. As deposition techniques hit micron precision and coil fabrication hit tighter phase control, the math finally had a place to land. Field arrays could be rotated and phased to favor one side of a cycle over another in ways that, in theory, nudge inertia's grip. Not by pushing mass, but by modulating the medium the mass sits in. It's not magic. It's engineering a context. Human costs kept pace. A grad student who co-authored a quiet paper on field-structured materials got a job offer from a contractor with no web presence and a non-standard NDA. A postdoc who tried to replicate an anomaly in an open lab found his proposal unscored, then watched a similar project move into restricted facilities. A senior theorist retired early, muttering that the interesting work had left the journals and gone where citations don't matter. The odd constant that shadowed the papers, the patents, and the firmware isn't proof of anything by itself. But it's the seam line you can thumb across decades. It appears in a 195's note as a hum no one could place, in a 200's derivation as a phase condition, and in a leaked Aurora schematic as a resonance target. 230 kHz, penciled, circled, and underlined. Theory didn't leap. It crept, one careful step at a time, until the ring could hum and a pedestal could feel cold. Theory is one thing. Now let's see the machine they built around it. The device, architecture of an impossible drive. They didn't call it a drive on the drawings. It was a field-structured test assembly, a phrase that hides a revolution in a lab coat. Picture a core ring about the size of a truck tire, but dense, layered, and cold. The heart was the metamaterial liner. Those alternating bismuth and magnesium zinc sheets laid up in a spiral stack, microns thin, edge-polished like optics, vacuum-cured until the layers behaved as one. The liner sat inside a segmented housing with channels for cryo flow and mounts for coils that didn't look like coils until you saw the winding maps. Stakes were blunt. If this architecture worked, fuel became an old word. The housing held a phase array of electromagnetic coils, each section independently driven, each clocked to a timing plan that read like choreography. Control demanded a bus that could deliver fast, clean power without the usual heat. So they built a cryo-cooled distribution spine that kept resistive losses down and noise out. Every cable was a truce between voltage and purity. Every connector was a weak point they treated like a bomb fuse. Action was in the sequence. The ring pre-chilled through the channels until the liner sat a few degrees above frost, stable and quiet. Then the firmware pushed the array into rotation. Fields chasing fields around the circumference at a resonance marked on the leak, 230 kHz. The coils didn't just spin power, they shaped it, flipping phase and steps so the peaks reinforced one side of the cycle and undercut the other. Annotations on the diagram called it ZPF coupling, the kind of label that starts arguments. To the people who built it, it was timing. Evidence lived in the notes. A handwritten arrow pointed to the liner with phase array coils, delta equals n pi/12, rev c, and a box around resonance lock plus or minus 0.5% dot. A printed block diagram labeled a feedback loop, Ceruan lock, and tied it to a sensor set that wasn't standard, magnetometers, RF sniffers, and thermistors and patterns that made sense only if you were listening for a medium changing, not a motor turning. The firmware variable names matched what the procurement hinted. Hermes handled the phase scheduler, Ceruan handled stability when the ring burped. Human moments seeped through. An assembly tech said he got headaches near the active unit, a pressure feeling like you feel on a fast elevator. Another wrote about a time smear, seconds that felt thick during resonance hold. He checked his watch, and the lab clock disagreed by a blink. No one put time distortion in a report. They logged subjective perception shift and moved on. The leaked performance notes, redacted to near gibberish, left one intact phrase: pilot exposure limits, followed by a black bar long enough to hide numbers that matter. This was the moment everything changed for performance. Internal notes credited right-angle maneuvers to vector neutralization within active envelope, a mouthful that means the craft didn't need to bank, it pivoted. Silent acceleration came from the absence of combustion and moving parts. Fields don't roar. The only sound was the hum and the building's hardware complaining. One line described instantaneous velocity step within sensor error margin. Careful words for a jump. Another hinted at EM blackout radius that killed electronics on cue. That explained the orders for isolators and sacrificial gaskets. Complications were everywhere you look. Stability was a beast. The unit burped, a term they used without irony, when the phase slipped or a coil missed a beat. During a burp, power spiked for a heartbeat, then died, taking nearby equipment with it. Asterisks flagged operator shielding advisory, which likely translated to don't stand close. The firmware team built Ceruan to catch the onset. Ocean-derived parameters, if the tag means what. It seems, feeding back a correction before the ring wandered off resonance and bit the room. Meanwhile, something else was happening across the hardware. The cryo bus that made the whole thing possible fought condensation and insulation failures, so they overbuilt the plumbing and wrapped the housing in layered shields that looked like thermal blankets but weren't. The stacks included thin foils we've seen before, bismuth in a different form, placed where the fields leaked. A side annotation circled EM flux fences and warned, do not breach during active. Impact on the lab culture was immediate. The machine didn't look like an engine, but everyone behaved like it could bite. Protocols multiplied. Phase maps checked twice, coil impedance logged every shift, liner inspected under T-Hertz lamp before each run. Some of it was superstition. Some of it was earned. The cold halo that hugged the liner edge during resonance, small, visible only if you cupped your hands and breathed, became a ritual tell that the lock was good. Tech started calling it the blue ring, even though you couldn't see a color. There was a human cost in the details they didn't publish. A contractor filed for tinnitus after weeks on the line. Another asked for a transfer after a series of nights left him wired and exhausted, like jet lag without the trip. They ran blood work on 2 pilots who sat near a larger rig and marked the file deferred, which is how you say, we don't know without admitting it. The architecture could move a craft. It could also move the people who touched it. Then the fix with the strange name landed. Ceruan entered as a parameter pack, ocean signatures mapped to coil timing. It stabilized the ring when the old loop couldn't. The origin would matter later, off Catalina, where water taught air how to behave. For now, in the desert, an impossible drive had a body, a layered heart, a phasing brain, a cold spine, and a voice you felt more than heard. The annotations weren't poetry. They were instructions for bending a rule, and the rule grudgingly bent. The ocean signature, Ceruan off Catalina. While the ring learned to behave in the desert, something uncanny was moving underwater. Off Catalina in the 201s, a Navy sonar team logged a target that refused to act like a submarine. Stakes were immediate: safety of crews, credibility of operators, and careers that shatter if you see what the doctrine says can't be there. The contact slid in at a depth layer where temperature tricks sensors, but this wasn't a thermal prank. The screen drew a shape, lost it, found it again in a place it shouldn't reach without showing a wake. Action started on a routine watch. The operator, steady hands, 10 years on the stack, tagged a return with a note. No cavitation signature. That phrase shouldn't exist. Anything that moves fast underwater pushes water, and pushing water leaves bubbles and heat. The waterfall display stayed clean. No froth, no plume, no thermal bloom on the infrared. Instead, a tight echo that hopped rather than swam, holding position against a current like it was pinned in place by something not in the manuals. He typed a word they'd only use later: tick. Evidence wasn't a single clip. It was a month of logs showing anomalies that clustered around a parameter the boat's software didn't care about until someone told it to. A firmware update rolled in mid-deployment, routine enough to ignore. Stability improvements, noise rejection, minor fixes. Buried in the change list, a line: Ceruan lock enhancements. The operator noticed because the color theme in a diagnostic panel flashed blue when the filter snapped on. The filter did more than reject noise. It carved out a corridor of signal the old algorithms missed and held a tone like a tuning fork. Meanwhile, across the compartment, an acoustic specialist ran a cross-correlation and frowned. The returns were tight, too tight, as if the target wasn't displacing water so much as stepping through it. He flagged the trace and wrote, "Target moved like it wasn't pushing water." It read like metaphor. He didn't mean poetry. He meant the math. The Doppler shift didn't match known propulsion. There was motion without churn. He checked the thermals again and found a negative. Water a fraction cooler in a bubble around the echo, a cold pocket sliding through warmer layers like a phantom. This was the moment everything changed for the ocean file. The system began labeling certain tracks with a tag that wasn't standard. Ceruan appeared in the metadata string, not on the operator's UI, but in the export headers that ride along when you print a plot. That tag, Ceruan lock, matched a firmware variable name we'd seen in a desert diagram. 2 programs didn't share code on paper, but a parameter was crossing between sea and sand. The filter stabilized the read when the target burped, the same word engineers used when the ring slipped phase and ate electronics. Human moments kept it honest. The operator's buddy joked, "We're chasing blue fish," until the watch officer told them to cut chatter. After the shift, he walked topside and stared at a flat patch of sea that felt too quiet, like sound had been turned down in a circle you could only trace if you were listening. He texted his wife, "We had a weird one, like the water forgot how to slosh." She sent back a heart and a grocery list. He didn't reply. Impact hit the integration teams. Ocean data flowed to a compartment that didn't do patents for fun. They pulled signatures and fed them into timing models. The Ceruan parameters, phase offsets tied to a moving medium, became a patch for the desert drive's stability problem. If water could teach a ring how to hold lock, the fix was worth its weight in bismuth. The phase map widened its tolerance window, catching the onset of a burp before the spike. Electronics died less often. Headaches dropped a notch. The cold halo sharpened. Complications surfaced because control is never free. The boats began to pick up collateral silence, zones where sonar lost bite when the target was active. You don't want blind spots at sea. The brass wanted explanations. The briefings used careful words. Non-kinetic interaction, index modulation, phrases borrowed from optics shoved into the ocean. Skeptics said layer thermals and currents can fake magic. Analysts reran the data on old software. The anomalies faded when the Cerulean filter was off, which didn't comfort anyone who understood filters reveal as much as they invent. The point wasn't that the filter made a ghost. It was that it held a returning tone long enough to measure. Meanwhile, Procurement echoed the shift. A contractor with a history that touched 1954 quietly won a support contract for Oceanic signal analytics, a euphemism for teach us what the blue tag hears. The same company filed an invoice with a line item, parameter sweep CL pack, that mapped to the desert team's patch notes. One firm, 3 eras, running signals through machines in air and water. The circle was tightening around a signature, not a hull. Human cost edged in. A sonar tech asked for shore duty after months of nights, with a ringing in his ears that audiology couldn't calibrate. Another wrote in his exit interview, "I'm okay not being believed." You don't write that unless your screen showed you something your language can't carry. The logs kept their calm tone. The metadata kept printing cerulean. What nobody knew at the time, unless they touched both programs, was how literal the handoff became. A firmware string in the ocean pack, hashed and tucked away, matched a checksum in the Desert Drive's controller. Not a coincidence. A handshake. The stability loop that made a cold pocket glide underwater was the same loop that stopped a ring from spitting on a bench. Catalina's quiet taught the desert how to stay quiet. The ocean gave the drive its blue name and its temper. The contractor, one company, 3 eras. While Cerulean stitched sea to sand, a quieter thread bound 1954 to the desert bench. A contractor whose name never makes press releases, only footers. Stakes were obvious to anyone who's watched black programs grow. Monopoly on exotic metallurgy and signal analytics means you don't just get paid, you decide who learns. The company's public face changed every decade, logos refreshed, missions rephrased, but the signature stayed. Materials first, sensors second, integration always. Action starts in a filing cabinet. An archival merger notice from the late 1980s folds a small Midwest metallurgical lab into a larger defense outfit known for quiet power. That lab's lineage traces back to an Air Force materials unit with a P.O. box at Wright-Patterson and a habit of publishing under staff initials. One surname appears in a 1954 CC list beside sample 72B, resurfaces in a 1997 patent on thin film deposition for high diamagnetic composites, and again in a 2015 white paper on oceanic signal persistence. Different first names, same family. Meanwhile, the parent firm absorbs a boutique sensor analytics startup whose founders once consulted on sonar filters. Their first classified award arrives the next quarter. Evidence hides in FOIA crumbs and procurement metadata. The shell LLCs from our Bismuth orders list a subcontractor code that resolves to this firm's materials division. A shipping manifest labels a crate, liner assemblies, Rev MK2 Hermes. The consignee? A logistics hub the contractor manages near a test corridor, the one with a runway that doesn't show on tourist maps. In a separate tranche, an ocean analytics contract references CL parameter set, an acronym that matches Cerulean's change logs. On the company's careers page, buried requests seek metallurgists with layered anisotropy experience and DSP engineers with non-stationary resonance tracking skills. Those phrases don't belong together unless you're building a ring to hum and code to keep it steady. Human moments slip through in ways corporate can't sanitize. An ex-employee remembers the non-disclosure culture as a running joke. They sent birthday cards with the line, "You saw nothing, celebrate anyway." Another describes a training where the instructor bans the word anti-gravity, then hands out a glossary that defines inertia mitigation envelope. A machinist says he was asked to lap bismuth sheets until he could see his fingerprint ridges in the reflection, then denied he'd ever worked on bismuth when he filed his hours. This was the moment everything changed for continuity. The firm's materials division publishes a conference abstract, harmless on its face, about magnesium-bismuth interface stability under thermal cycling. The language mirrors a 190 SAXS internal memo almost sentence for sentence, except the old memo called the stack not manufacturable, and the abstract calls it production ready. The company never presents the talk. The session chair marks it withdrawn. 3 weeks later, freight invoices show regular refrigerated shipments outbound from their facility to the desert hub. The crates are too small to be engines and too heavy to be empty. Complications pile up wherever sunlight tries to land. A congressional inquiry sends letters asking why one contractor shows up on both exotic metallurgy buys and Oceanic analytics. The response cites waived special access program protections. Staffers shrug. Waived SAP means you don't get to see. A state auditor notices tax credits claimed for clean room expansion at a plant that, on paper, makes aircraft brackets. The plant adds a second shift with no new job titles. Security badges change color. Meanwhile, the company's fingerprints are on firmware too. A leaked checksum from the ocean's Ceruan pack matches a build artifact generated by the Contractors Embedded Systems Group. Their internal codename for the scheduler, Hermes, shows up in a training deck slide captured on a phone in a conference room with the lights off. The slide's subtitle reads, Phase Orchestration Across Heterogeneous Media. You don't write that unless your coils are listening to water on Monday and air on Tuesday. Impact is subtle and profound. By living across 3 domains, metallurgy, sensing, and control, the contractor preserves memory that institutions forget. When a new program manager rotates in, they brief him from notebooks with coffee stains older than his career. The 1954 initials aren't a ghost story, they're a genealogy. That continuity lets them iterate outside public science's tempo. The materials team hands a liner to the coil guys, who hand a log to the ocean analysts, who hand a phase patch back to the desert. No paper trail ties it in public, but the work moves like a baton. Human cost sits between lines. An engineer who asked whether layered bismuth stacks matched certain legacy samples found his email access throttled and his badge hours restricted to daylight. A junior DSP coder pushed a change that stabilized a noisy lock and got a raise with a clause that clawed back if he ever left for academia. He framed the offer letter anyway. People don't stay for the money alone. They stay because the hum is real. Complication never leaves. Competitors file protests and get boilerplate. Lawmakers threaten hearings and get briefed into silence. The contractor moves a fence line, buries new conduit, and hires more guards. If oversight can't see it, can the data speak for itself? The answer had been hiding in our logs all along. The data forensics, verifying the leak without burning sources. We didn't publish. Not at first. We locked the files in an offline box and treated them like a live wire. Stakes were simple. If we named the wrong detail, we'd burn the engineer, lose the contractor window, and poison any chance to cross-check. If we stayed too cautious, we'd drift into myth. The plan was a narrow ridge. Prove as much as we could without exposing the path we took to get there. Action started with fingerprints the authors didn't intend to leave. Every PDF carries a scent, producer strings, font subsets, object order. The Aurora packet split into 3 families by those tells. Lab diagrams exported from a CAD tool licensed to a specific defense vendor. Memos flattened by a print-to-image driver common in SAP enclaves. Logs generated by a range package that timestamps entries with a 7-millisecond jitter pattern, unique to its 201's build. None of that proves content. It proves habitat. These pages grew in the dark. Checksums told a second story. The firmware bundle labeled with Hermes and Ceruan compiled to a hash that matched one seen months earlier in an Ocean Analytics pack with a different file name. Separate sources, same build artifact. We verified by reassembling the blob from its chunked attachments. Each chunk carried a CRC that landed where it should. If someone forged it, they forged a very boring, very specific bug in the compressor that only shows up when the pack includes a deprecated font. That bug shows up in the Navy Ceruan release too. Meanwhile, we time-bounded everything. Metadata can lie, but weather can't remember to coordinate with forgers. The range logs hold 3 hours, 14 minutes, and 26 seconds paired with a line, wind shear spike, dash, and a note about a gust that the operator wrote off as a sensor fart. We pulled public mesonet data for that county an hour. A transient shear shows in 2 stations 20 miles apart at 3:14, small but there. On a satellite thermal pass from the same night, A faint cold spot appears where nothing should be cold. It's subtle, 2 pixels across, but those frames match the log window, not the hour before or after. You can call that coincidence. You can't call it engineering. We checked style against known SAP templates. The memo layout used an internal header code that nests classification markings in a way only a handful of offices do. The redaction blocks weren't rectangles, they were vector masks layered above text streams, applied with a tool whose default naming scheme leaves anots/anots2/anots2_copy in the PDF object tree. Government redactions usually render to bitmaps on export. These stayed live because someone rushed. That matters later. Human error gave us one of the strongest anchors. Our analyst toggled layers and found a single variable name peeking under a mask on page 7. Cerulean_lock_threshold. We didn't extract the number, we didn't need to. The presence of that exact string in both ocean firmware and desert control ties 2 compartments without saying their names out loud. When we searched public CV databases for that string, we got nothing. When we searched the contractors' code repos on a closed mirror we shouldn't have had, we got 1 hit. A comment lowered for saline, in a branch that merged 6 weeks before the Catalina run. A mask can hide ink. It can't hide the smell of a shop. This was the moment everything changed for confidence. The memo's acronym soup matched the oddities insiders use without thinking. Waived SAP, 2-person integrity, note, bury under O&M, the bureaucratic trick of funding physics from maintenance. The diagram legends used a unit suffix that only one coil vendor writes that way. A tiny typo in a power spec, KW as KW, mirrored the same vendor's datasheet error from 2014. Separate files, same fingerprints. We stress-tested skeptics' claims. If it's a hoax, it's a composite. If it's a composite, scenes show. We ran line break analysis on the longest memo. The embedded font's map showed 3 subsets, none of which appear in typical desktop exports. Kerning on the word non-terrestrial matched a PostScript engine you don't find on home machines. The Procurement screenshot EXIF looked scrubbed, no camera tags, but carried monitor profile data from a model common in CIFs. A forger could build that, but why also include a 1-pixel white hairline in the bottom margin that repeats at 8.5-inch intervals across 3 pages? That hairline appears in a known SAP presentation we FOIA'd 5 years ago. It's the output quirk of a specific secure printer line. Meanwhile, we avoided the trap of absolute claims. We marked the packet probable authentic, not proven. We didn't validate physics with PDFs. We validated that the people who produced these files worked where they claim, used the tools those places buy, and embedded mistakes those places always make. We kept source identities behind a wall. No IP addresses, no email headers, no printer. Serials that could be backtracked. When we needed a third-party check, we used public anchors, whether logs, satellite frames, procurement dates, not anything a security officer could tie to a badge swipe. Impact. We could say out loud that the leak's internal coherence survived hostile reading. The firmware hash handshake is a bridge. The timestamps align with outside phenomena nobody curated. The language matches offices that don't test new verbs in public. And the single exposed variable name, born from a sloppy redaction layer, clicked with an ocean tag we'd already traced. We still didn't have a confession. We had a pattern that resisted scissors. Tease the next move, one redaction hides a location. The memo references hangar safety, crosswind mitigations, then blacks the site name. But the weather notes list a gust from an angle that only makes sense if the runway is oriented in a very specific way. That's enough to triangulate without trespassing. Chase the weather, and the map starts to talk. The hangar, triangulating the test site. We started with the gust. The memo's redaction sliced the site name, but left crosswind mitigations and a heading vector that didn't match most desert runways. Pair that with the timestamp, and you get a wind from 140 degrees at 18 knots. We pulled FAA charts and scraped local mesonet logs, then narrowed to fields where a 140 crosswind would force the technical notes they quoted. 3 candidates fit. Only one sat within a day's drive of the vendors shipping bismuth liners under refrigeration. Stakes were sharp. Draw a circle on a map, and you invite trouble, trespass, legal lines, people who don't joke about fences. We didn't step over. We built the footprint from public irritations. Acoustic complaints filed by locals who don't call anything in unless the cattle spook. Utility board minutes about temporary power draw anomalies, buried under line upgrades. County permits for subsurface conduit replacement around a building already wired like a hospital. Action took the form of correlations. The range logs mentioned micro brownouts near test windows. We found a cluster of customer outage reports, 30-second flickers, on dates that line up with the ring's maintenance nights. A retired lineman told us they had a sag that shouldn't happen on that feeder. Meanwhile, weather notes in the memos mentioned dust devils along perimeter. Satellite shots on those days show faint spirals that blossom in a corridor downwind of one compound in particular. That corridor runs parallel to a long, pale strip you don't find on public aeronautical charts. Evidence sharpened with heat that wasn't heat. We bought a stack of commercial satellite thermal frames and subtracted averages. Every time the drive logs hit hold, a cold blotch appeared near the south wall of one hangar, 2 to 3 degrees below ambient for a few minutes, then gone. It isn't snow. It's not shadow. The blotch moves with the hours we pulled from the memos. You can call it atmospheric weirdness once, not 5 times. Human moments push the pin in. A rancher whose land kisses the fence line told us. Nights go quiet, then my truck clocks reset. He meant radios go dead, engines run, the world hushes for a beat. He doesn't want fame. He wants his cattle calm. A school bus driver on the county road keeps 2 watches. One stays on time. The other drifts a few seconds late every couple of weeks. She stopped mentioning it after a base liaison smiled too long. This was the moment everything changed. Logistics started to match physics. Freight trackers caught a refrigerated box truck pulling into a side gate at 2:11 a.m., unloading in 20 minutes, leaving with a return signature from a contractor we've met before. The same truck hit the Ocean Analytics facility 6 months earlier with a similar time stamp. The plates swap between 2 shell carriers. The telematics pings don't. You can fake paperwork. It's harder to fake antenna noise. Meanwhile, across the fence, construction crews buried new lines. The county posted dig notices for fiber upgrades, but the trench width and the spool labels belong to cryo plumbing and heavy power. Aerial photos from last year show a corrugated structure sprouting a new annex with thicker roofing and a vent stack that isn't for air conditioning. The vents line up with the hangar bay where the cold blotches bloom. Somebody learned to keep the halo inside. Complications kept us honest. One of our early candidates had similar wind and power data, but no thermal signature. Another had the cold frames, but sat too far from the bismuth supply to make sense on a fuel budget. We tossed both and stuck with the one place where all the weird points overlap. Acoustic reports, crosswind notes, power sags, and a runway orientation that fits the memo's angle like a key. Impact revealed a shape, a plausible facility footprint with rolls. The long bay with the new vents is the ring room. A shorter, outbuilding with oversized doors is shipping for liner assemblies. A stubby block with extra grounding straps is the control room. Wrapped in EMP gaskets, you can see if you zoom far enough. The perimeter fence bristles more on the south side, where the cold leaks when they miss. A new guard shack appeared last quarter, and the signage changed from range support to a number and a colored triangle that means nothing publicly and everything privately. Human cost sits at the gate. A contractor we spoke to off the record said they added a clause to his badge agreement. No pacemakers, no metal implants near Bay 3. He laughed when he signed, then stopped laughing after his smartwatch hard reset on a smoke break. He keeps it in his locker now. A janitor's cousin told us she wears earplugs on night shifts because the air presses when the lights dim and the hum climbs. She doesn't have words for pressure that isn't wind. The last breadcrumb came from the sky. A commercial imaging bird captured a series of frames with faint lensing artifacts on hot afternoons. Straight lines bending a hair near the hangar's south door. It's barely there, an optical quirk you'd ignore if you didn't already have a wall of files about cold halos and dead electronics. We're not calling it a warp. We're calling it a place where air behaves like it forgot a rule. Complication closes the map. The facility poured fresh concrete and ran more cable underground. Whatever we caught is going deeper. The dig notices say utilities modernization. The memos call it bury the lines. We have the where. Now we need the why, the control motive that keeps a working drive under a roof while the world burns fuel in the open. Motive, why keep a working drive secret? They never wrote, hide the future on a slide. They didn't need to. The internal deck that landed in our inbox wore safer titles. Strategic asymmetry, controlled rollout, civil grid disruption risk. It read like policy, but every bullet had a shadow. If you can dial down inertia and sip power while moving, fuel economies collapse. If you can hold a cold bubble and ignore drag, airframes become antiques. Whoever owns that first controls not just the battlefield, but markets, shipping lanes, energy politics, the scaffolding of who gets to call shots. Stakes were global. A working drive isn't a new jet. It's independence from combustion, from shipping choke points, from refueling diplomacy. One slide drew a world map with dotted arcs and the word reach. Another showed a silent craft icon hovering above a city and the caption, non-kinetic dominance. The pitch was simple: keep it close until we can't be caught. That was the military argument. The civil argument sat 2 pages later. Uncontrolled dissemination risks destabilizing grids and transportation infrastructures. Translation: if the ring leaks before standards exist, someone will strap a bootleg to a van and learn the hard way why pilot exposure limits got black bars. Action looked like bureaucracy doing what it was built to do: limit variables. The program justified budgets with phrases like non-proliferation by denial, not by treaty, by absence. You can't regulate what the world doesn't officially have. Risk matrices ranked peer adoption pathways against domestic social disruption. One risk box cited loss of fiscal instruments tied to fuel. Another flagged urban noise profile shift, which sounds benign until you realize quiet skies change how police, protest, and surveillance work. The memo didn't moralize. It accounted. Evidence of intent ran through funding notes. Maintenance lines hid physics buys. A footnote routed safety research to a medical annex, not aviation, keeping FAA eyes off. A briefing to an energy subcommittee used the phrase, off-grid modalities require careful staging, paired with a timeline that jumped a decade whenever the word public appeared. Meanwhile, in a thread not meant for wide eyes, a program manager wrote, "We solved it, then locked it away." He didn't add a sad face. He added a task: revised classification guide to define inertia mitigation artifacts. Human moments cut through the calculus. The engineers aside, "We solved it, then locked it away," wasn't bitterness. It was regret shaped like a sentence. A junior analyst wrote a note to himself after reading the civil disruption slide. But kids breathe smoke now. He deleted it before sending, then dragged the file to a folder labeled Ethics he never opened again. On a whiteboard in a secure room, someone drew a ring and wrote "Gridless?" A day later, the board was clean and a printed sign warned against value-laden language. This was the moment everything changed inside the compartment. The slides shifted from if to when and from test to deploy selectively. A pilot program for strategic reconnaissance got priority. A proposal for disaster relief power pods got deferred. The rationale was plausible. Pilots are trained flood zones. Are chaotic, but a line at the bottom told the deeper story. Domestic visibility risk unacceptable. Put simply, you can fly a black craft over an ocean and deny it. You can't roll a miracle into a hurricane and ask everyone not to notice. Meanwhile, competing motives pressed in. Intelligence briefings flagged foreign research on field propulsion. Papers and journals nobody in Congress reads. Patents that echo ideas the drive team had already prototyped. That fueled the asymmetry argument. Hold until countermeasures exist, then shape norms. Contractors lobbied with a different spin: market capture. If they could mature the architecture quietly, they'd own licensing when the dam broke. Their pitch to a finance office showed conservative revenue bands that still made oil-era profits blush. Complications crowded the edges. Leaks don't wait for policy. Pilots talk. Technicians swap headaches. A cold spot on a desert wall shows up on a satellite. You can't run a program at this scale and expect silence forever. The slides anticipated it. One deck carried a page titled Narrative Containment, offering decoys. Hypersonic plane myths, plasma stealth chatter, a drip of patents that look impossible enough to trivialize the real thing. Each serves a purpose: give skeptics something to debunk, give believers something to chase, keep the middle numb. Human cost wasn't a footnote. We saw lists of reassigned staff, badge pulls after inappropriate language and documentation. Families moved after a clearance review found a cousin blogged about UAPs in college. The policy minds would say that's the price of guarding a crown jewel. The engineer's notebook disagreed in ink. If not now, when? He underlined, when, with a hand that shook. Impact of suppression is visible in absence. Materials breakthroughs that could bend energy use stay niche. Public labs get scraps and call them grant seasons. Grid tech inches while a cold halo sits in a hangar. The motive is control, of advantage, of pace, of narrative. It's also fear, of accidents, of misuse, of a world that moves faster than the people paid to steer it. Complication becomes guilt when storms hit, when fuel spikes, when pilots retire with stories they only tell in kitchens. The machine that could have been a lifeboat is a weapon first. That's the logic of empires and budgets. It doesn't have to be the logic of an engineer with a thumb drive and a line he won't cross anymore. The pressure cooker doesn't hiss forever. It bursts the moment someone sends one file. The leak night, how the file got out. He told himself it wasn't a leak. It was a backup, a belt and suspenders copy in case a server burped the way the ring did. He picked the maintenance window they all used because routine is camouflage. Midnight to 4, low lights, skeleton crew. He had documentation privileges now, and documentation touches everything. The plan was small. Pull a firmware pack to compare revision notes, archive a memo chain that shouldn't have hit his inbox, and walk away with nothing that would get a badge scanner to blink twice. Stake sat on his desk like a family photo, mortgage, college funds, a retirement calculator that had finally turned green. He weighed them against the line in his notebook. We solved it, then locked it away, and found his hands moving faster than his fear. He staged it as a routine controller integrity check. Thumb drive in the pocket of a maintenance polo, the one with a stitched logo bland enough to pass any guard. He entered the bay, signed the log, and counted a slow 5 before he looked at the unit. Action was muscle memory dressed as obedience. He badged into the console room, drew the blackout curtain, and set the controller to test mode. Hermes scheduler sim, Ceruan disabled, no coil power to avoid a hum that would bring a curious nose. He plugged his drive into a port labeled Field Updates Only, the kind contractors use when they push hotfixes. The system flashed a warning he'd expected, dual credentials required. He'd already arranged the overlap. A colleague across the building, on a different task, pinged the same control domain for a diagnostics job. For 1 minute, 2 valid logins were active. The controller couldn't tell intent. It could only tell keys. He mirrored the directory tree, skipping the big blobs. The compiled Coil's code would flag in seconds, and targeted the text, classification guides, timing diagrams, and one memo chain with the 1954 reference that wouldn't let him sleep. He named the folder fw_rollback_notes_Q3 and kept the cursor blinking on a fake changelog while the copy ran behind it. 30 seconds, then 45. The system wrote checksums to a log. He watched the hash values with the detached calm of a man soldering next to a fuel line. Evidence of how close he cut it shows in the audit trail we saw later. An admin alert, concurrent session overlap, investigative persistent, generated and auto-closed because the overlap cleared. In under a minute, the cleanup script purged temp dumps at 3:15. His copy finished at 3 hours 14 minutes and 26 seconds, the exact second branded into his sleep. He ejected the drive and left the fake changelog open, the way a lazy tech would. Human moments stuck like burrs. On the walk out, he paused in the corridor and listened for the ring. No hum. He hated that he missed it. At the door, the guard asked about the game. He guessed the score wrong and both laughed. His hand shook signing the clipboard. Outside, the night air tasted metallic, like after a dental x-ray, and the asphalt radiated a heat the stars couldn't explain. He looked up, texted one word to a number he'd never used before. Out. Then he turned the phone off, removed the battery, and dropped both pieces into separate glovebox compartments he'd lined with aluminum tape months earlier. Impact hit before dawn. The first internal alert flagged unusual metadata aggregation on the controller, a heuristic tune to catch sloppy exfil. He wasn't sloppy. He'd copied small files that normally traveled during audits. Still, a human saw the cluster and kicked a stone. By noon, security had pulled the logs and found the overlap. They froze 2 credentials for review, his and the other engineers, and ran a pattern search for removable media. Policy locked badge readers to amber. A memo drafted that afternoon defined narrative containment for the first time in this program's life. Complications followed the predictable script. The colleague whose login overlapped got a courtesy interview that wasn't courteous. He cried, swore he was nowhere near Bay 3, and he wasn't. His keystrokes say so. They reinstated him and flagged him as watch for association. Our engineer got a new assignment. Remote documentation, no console access, no night shifts. His badge still opened the building for now. He spent 3 days pretending to reorganize a folder tree, while a team he'd never met scanned his email, his workstation mirror, and his locker for dust he didn't leave. Meanwhile, the file didn't fly to a reporter or a forum. He built a buffer. He walked the thumb drive into a friend's garage 3 towns away, someone who thought he fixed routers for a living, and stashed it in a sealed junction box on a dead wall. He waited a week, then pulled it, cloned it twice, and hid the twins with people who didn't know each other. Only then did he route a copy through a relay that washed IPs in a tangle he'd practiced. He labeled the packet like a contractor labels a parts bin: boring, correct, overlooked. Human cost turned personal the night his daughter asked why he wasn't riding the motorcycle anymore. He told her the weather was off. He meant the air around the ring and the air around his life. He started parking 2 blocks from home and walking, listening for footsteps that never came. He kept the memo in his wallet, folded to the line that said Legacy Alloy Sample, 1954, as if paper could testify if he disappeared. This was the moment everything changed, because a thumb drive isn't just storage, it's a choice made solid. Inside the building, terminations came quietly. A policy slid into inboxes titled Narrative Containment, proposing Aurora as a plain myth to soak up attention. Outside, a file marked FW_rollback_notes_Q3 landed, where people who hear hums read carefully. He hadn't proven the lift. He'd seeded the proof of intent, of persistence, of a machine built to bend a rule, and he'd done it without the ring singing once. The cover story, the hypersonic ghost. The plane was a gift. It arrived as a whisper in the late 198s, triangles in the night, booms over the Mojave, contrails that kinked like a broken whip. They called it Aurora, a name that stuck to magazine covers and late-night radio like frost. It didn't matter that no procurement line ever called a jet that. The legend did what legends do. It soaked up questions that didn't want answers. Stakes were national. If the ring existed, the country needed a decoy that journalists could chase without ever nearing a hangar that breathed cold. Hypersonic talk was perfect. It promised speed without magic, booms without silence, budget wars that reporters knew how to narrate. A jet leaves marks that scientists can argue about: shock diamonds, wake patterns, fuel rumors. A field drive leaves absences, quiet, right angles, cold pockets. Put a loud story in front of a quiet machine, and the world will reach for noise. Action unfolded in public view. Spotters along the Edwards corridors heard double-pulse booms and swore a wedge had split the sky. Camera clubs hauled tripods to twilight ridgelines and shot grainy triangles that looked convincing from a mile away. Patent offices filled with filings about pulse detonation engines, high-speed inlets, fuels that burned too cold to be real. DARPA launched programs with names that sounded like rockets in tuxedos. Each cycle fed the next. When a contrail corkscrewed, they called it Aurora. When a fuel depot reported a draw at 3 a.m., they called it Aurora. The word became a bucket. Evidence of seeding sits where ink dries. A plain patent here, a concept sketch there, all plausible enough to keep editors happy. A declassified paper on vortex lift at extreme Mach landed the same month a procurement notice funded material stresses under thermal spikes. Those belonged to someone's hypersonic proposal. They also made great cover text for liner experiments that heated nothing but space between layers. The decoy wasn't a single document. It was an ecosystem of maybes. Human Moments sold it. An aviation buff we found kept a notebook labeled Aurora Sightings in his glove box, dates and boom times logged with the care of a birder. He told us about the night the sky thumped twice and his dog hid under the truck. He drove the perimeter roads for hours after, eyes up, seeing lights that were stars and stars that were bugs, and believing it all added up to a fast plane slipping home. He never saw a triangle land. He didn't need to. The chase was the proof. This was the moment everything changed for misdirection. The plane's story covered the wrong signatures well, and the right signatures badly. Sonic booms don't explain dead electronics in a circle around a hangar. Contrails don't explain thermal blanks where air should glow. If you stack the supposed Aurora sightings against nights when the cold halo hugged the south wall, the timelines don't link. That disconnect is the tell. A cover story that fails at the details you only notice if you stand too close. Meanwhile, deliberate nudges kept the myth alive. A test article with sharp edges taxied in view of a long lens, then vanished behind a hangar and was loaded into a container that didn't belong to a runway. A FOIA release coughed up a drawing of a triangular intake array that never flew, alongside a memo that quietly referenced narrative containment. A contractor ran a glossy brochure with silhouettes of aircraft that never got names. All on purpose, all to keep the word Aurora noisy and aerodynamic. Complications broke through when the ocean logs went blue. The Ceruan tags, the cold pockets, the not pushing water notes, none of that fits a scramjet. A plane can sprint. It can't hold a cube of quiet in air or water. Pilots started filing reports with words that didn't match hypersonic training. Stillness before a jump, no roll into a turn, a blur without a roar. The cover story frayed where the physics didn't follow. Human cost crept into the lie. Journalists built careers on the hypersonic ghost, writing around real secrecy with a myth that felt accessible. Some retired proud, never knowing they'd helped keep a different secret safe. Others knew and chose the safer chase. One told us, off the record, planes get me published. Fields get me ghosted. He wasn't wrong. The culture prefers wings. Impact was a shield that worked for decades. Budgets hid in advanced propulsion demonstrators. Fences got higher while magazines debated inlet geometry. The ring matured under headlines about fuels that never shipped. The ghost plane took the heat. The drive cooled in peace. Then the math cracked the myth. Right-angle turns don't file flight plans. Cold halos don't cast contrails. Electronics don't die from a boom that hasn't happened yet. The story couldn't stretch to fit. That's when testimony rushed in, pilots, techs, operators, speaking a language the hypersonic script couldn't translate. The cover story did its job until it met logs that didn't care what you wanted to believe. Everything was about to change when a new pattern emerged. Witnesses across programs describing the same hum, the same quiet, the same jump. The ghost plane stopped being enough. Cross-verification, witnesses, pilots, and patterns. While the ghost plane hogged headlines, people with skin in the game started speaking in specifics. Stakes were reputations and careers. Pilots don't file strange reports lightly. Technicians don't log anomalies that make them sound superstitious. But the pattern wouldn't stay quiet. And when patterns rhyme across years, you either test them or admit you're afraid of the answer. A Navy pilot we interviewed off tape described the stillness first. Everything calmed, he said, like the air got thick. Then the jump, no build, no roll, just a new place. He checked instruments and saw a flicker in the attitude indicators that maintenance later called unrepeatable. He still taps his wrist when he remembers it, not because of time lost, but because time felt wrong. Another flyer, different coast and decade, didn't say Tic Tac. He said, it moved like it owed inertia nothing. He paced his kitchen telling it, hands cutting right angles in the air, his voice dropping when he reached the part about silence. Technicians told it in the way only ground crew can, with failures you can schedule. On nights when a specific hum crept through the hangar, radios died in a neat circle. Flashlights worked at the edges and went faint in the center. EMI meters spiked and then fell flat as if the field itself refused to be measured. One avionics lead kept a log with a column titled Quiet Zone. He drew circles, wrote down diameters, and taped a coin at the top as a joke. 23 entries. Same room. Same radius within a foot. Evidence threaded through unrelated logs. In a desert maintenance hangar, infrared cameras recorded cold spots that bloomed and vanished with the same timing the ocean Ceruan tags favored. In a submarine control room, an acoustic specialist annotated tracks with no cavitation, and 3 months later, rotated to shore duty for sleep he couldn't keep. At a test range, a weather sensor registered microgusts that appear in the Aurora memos as wind shear notes, pinned to minute marks that match Coil controller holds. You don't get those co-alignments by accident. You get them when one machine touches 3 kinds of air. Meanwhile, skeptics offered alternatives: instrument aliasing, parallax illusions, pilot overstatement, thermal layers playing tricks on sonar. Fair. We took their list and tested it against the data we could touch. The aliasing claim dies where multiple sensor families agree. Infrared cold patches, magnetometer tremors, human ear pressure. Parallax doesn't explain dead electronics that return on command. Thermal layers don't produce negative blooms that move with firmware version numbers. A debunk that needs separate coincidences for land, sea, and sky is a story with too many ifs. This was the moment everything changed for confidence, not belief. A flight surgeon noted 2 pilots' vestibular tests clean after high-G-looking maneuvers that should have stressed their inner ears, consistent with turns that didn't load their bodies. A range electrician kept a drawer of toasted surge protectors labeled by test window. The pile climbs in periods when the Cerulean filter was offline. A civilian radar tech at a coastal station logged dropouts coincident with offshore acoustic weirdness, then scribbled, blue tag, because his friend on a boat taught him a word he wasn't supposed to know. Human microstories stitched the geometry. A crew chief, mid-shift, felt the air press, like an elevator that never moved, and watched his handheld freeze on midnight for a beat. A sonar operator grew a habit of humming under his breath, 230 kHz subharmonic mapped to something you can feel in your chest when you stand near certain machines. He didn't know the number. His body did. A line technician refused to wear his metal wedding band after it tingled near a bench on resonance nights. He kept it in a pocket and told his wife he'd lost weight. Impact is a pattern that mirrors the leak's specs so tightly it reads like a checklist. Cold pockets. Yem hum. Right angle motion. Silent acceleration. Dead zones for electronics. A resonance that prefers a narrow band. Exposure limits nobody will quantify. Independently, each is odd. Together, across eras and services, they stop being anecdotes and turn into a fingerprint. Complication remains. Extraordinary claims should carry extraordinary proof. We agree. That's why we keep the language plain. The leak doesn't prove a back-engineered drive. It does shrink the room for coincidence until people start bumping into each other. The next step isn't belief. It's replication you can film without a badge. The replication attempt, what we can test publicly. We didn't build a ring that could throw a pilot across the sky. We built what you can build without a badge, a forklift, or a letter from a senator. Stakes were simple. Stay legal, stay safe, and see if the edges of the leak touched the edges of our bench. If we saw nothing, we'd say so. If we saw a thread, we'd pull it. Action started with what we could source. Bismuth sheets aren't exotic. Neither is magnesium zinc. The trick is thickness and fidelity. We ordered bismuth foils down to a few microns, still thicker than the lore, but within reach, and magnesium zinc alloy sheet stock we could lap until adhesion was clean. We cut them into wafers, alternated layers, bismuth thin, magnesium thicker, then pressed them under vacuum with a polymer interleaf we knew we'd hate, but needed to survive handling. No spiral, no truck tire ring, just a palm-sized stack that looked like a dull sandwich and weighed too much for its size. We built the field around the stack like a frame around a painting. A coil set wrapped the perimeter, simple, counterwound pairs so we could drive rotating fields with a phase step small enough to matter. No cryobus, no heroic voltages. A clean supply, a bank of MOSFET drivers, a controller that let us walk frequency without jumping the rails. We kept the numbers sane. Tens of volts, single-digit amps, RF carried on tidy harnesses, ferrites where they should be, ground planes as if our lives depended on them. They might not. Our insurance did. Evidence would have to speak in whispers. We laid out instruments like we were wiring a lie detector. 2 scales under a damp platform. 1 live under the stack, 1 decoy under a blind mass, so thermal puffs and bench tremors would cancel. A magnetometer perched like a nervous bird. 3 thermistors, the good ones epoxied to the stack edge, the platform, and a meter away in still air. A laser vibrometer watched the coil mount so mechanical resonance couldn't fool us. And for our sanity, a cheap handheld EM meter that would squeal if we were just building a radio and calling it a breakthrough. We walked the dial. 1 kilohertz to 10, hum that tickles your teeth, nothing. 10 to 100, transformers in the wall complain, nothing. We slipped into the low hundreds, where the leak's margin scribble lives, and held our breath. The magnetometer nodded like a sleepy head. That's coil bleed, expected. The laser vibrometer stayed flat. The EM sniffer sang on schedule. We kept throttling voltage down to kill thermal drift, and let the platform settle. Then we saw it. It wasn't a leap. It was a hair. The scale under the stack ticked lighter by a fraction. So small it would vanish if you sneezed, so stubborn it returned when we dialed back to the same frequency. We detuned, and the effect fell away. We crept up, and it came back. The blind scale didn't budge. We swapped stacks, control layers with aluminum instead of bismuth, and the hair vanished. We brought bismuth back. The hair returned, not as large, not as clean, but there. If you want romance, you call it mass anomaly. We called it a number we'd argue about for a week. Meanwhile, the thermistors told their own quiet story. The edge of the stack dipped a fraction of a degree when the hair showed, while the platform held and the room sensor shrugged. We checked every stupid trick a lab can play. Air currents from the HVAC, current-induced cooling in wires, PT100 leads acting like antennas. We rerouted, shielded, swapped sensors, and repeated. The dip hung on. Not always, not forever, but enough to make you lean forward. Human moments snapped us to attention. One of us lifted the stack to reseat a lead and said, "I feel lighter," then laughed and set it down. That feeling didn't make it into the data, but his hand stopped shaking when the scale did the same tiny dance as before. Another turned off the overhead lights, superstition more than science, and we all stood in the hum listening for machinery that wasn't moving. We kept the door locked, not from spies, from our own urge to tell someone before we'd earned it. Complications came in a rush. At this scale, the world is a cheat. The stack warms and sneaks buoyancy into air nobody thinks about. Coils pull on screws you forgot were ferromagnetic. Wiring harnesses flex, and fake weight changes a hair at a time. We killed each suspect the boring way. Non-magnetic hardware, rigid mounts, thermal shields that made the bench look like a bad art project. The effect shrank when we tightened the world. It didn't vanish. We mapped frequency like cartographers. The sweet patch wasn't exactly 230 kilohertz. It sat near it, a shelf where small phase steps produced a notch in a plot we didn't expect. We shifted phase on the fly, one coil chasing the next, and the notch widened. If we held phase steady, the hair wandered. If we let the coils walk, the hair found home more often. That aligns with the leak's obsession with timing, not power. We tried to provoke failure on purpose, our own version of a burp. We let the drivers miss a beat and watched the scale spike heavier for a blink, then return. The EM sniffer died for a second. One of our USB hubs hard reset. Nobody wrote blackout radius. We wrote weird. Then we grounded everything again and swore off stunts. Impact measured, not promised. We saw small, reproducible anomalies consistent with the leaked principles. Not proof of mass reduction. Not lift you can film in a warehouse. A hint that a layered stack in a rotating field can do something air and wires can't explain away easily in a weekend. A tiny cold halo hugged a cheap version of a material we can't fabricate with 1954's discipline or 2025's budget. Phase control mattered more than brute force. Material choice mattered more than we wanted to admit. Human cost stayed small but real. After a week in the hum, one of us took a day off with a headache he blamed on coffee and didn't. Another found his smartwatch had skipped a second in the only window we'd label interesting. We're not logging exposure limits. We're logging caution. A fire extinguisher sat closer to the door. The lab cat stayed out of the room. Complication we can't punch through. Manufacturing precision. Our bismuth layers are thick by a factor of 5, our interface rough by a magnitude, our adhesion a compromise. The leak stacks were microns that behaved like mirrors. Our coils are off-the-shelf workhorses. Their winding maps looked like art. We're painting with house brushes and hoping for fine lines. Meaning for now. The public can test pieces without burning sources or breaking laws. Layered metals respond to phased fields in ways that don't collapse under first scrutiny. The anomalies we saw align with the drive's rumored fingerprints. A preference for a narrow band, sensitivity to phase choreography, a whisper of cold. It's not a machine you can ride. It's a direction you can walk. We'll publish the method, not the hype. The bill of materials is dull on purpose. The safety notes are louder than the claims. Others can repeat, fail, or refine. If the anomaly survives many hands, the conversation shifts from belief to engineering. If it dies, the leak still stands on its own legs, and we go back to the hangar and the ocean with better questions. Either way, fragments are already enough to matter. The cost of truth, people who paid the price. You don't need sirens to feel a crackdown. It arrives as calendar invites with no agenda, as badge permissions that blink amber where they used to go green, as a chair in a quiet room where someone rehearsed concern in a mirror. Stakes get personal fast, not theories, not memos, paychecks, marriages, sleep. It starts with reassignment, which looks harmless on paper. One avionics lead who kept a quiet zone column in his log got moved from night shifts near Bay 3 to a windowless archive room labeled Configuration Control. His new job title was longer. His hands stopped touching machines. He told his wife it was a promotion. 2 weeks later, their mortgage refi stalled when an internal flag put a hold on his employment verification. The lender never explained. He started cashing out overtime he didn't work. Clearance revocations don't read as punishment until your keycard stops opening the cafeteria. A junior DSP engineer, the one who widened a stability window by a hair, came back from a long weekend to find access temporarily suspended pending review. HR called it routine. Security called it due diligence. His team called it what it was, a message. He sat at a side desk for 6 weeks, doing documentation hygiene, while a new hire merged his code. He stopped wearing the company hoodie. Blacklisting is quieter than the word suggests. It looks like recruiters who stop returning calls and conference organizers who lose your email on purpose. A materials scientist we spoke to, who'd spent a decade learning to polish bismuth until it reflected ridges in a fingertip, applied to 3 public labs after her program listed her as reduction in force. Each lab had a committee see her resume and pass. One PI called after hours to say, "We can't touch your work. It comes with baggage." She cried once, cut her hair, and started a ceramic studio no one knows is hers. Health is where the hum cashes in debts. A technician filed for tinnitus after months of nights in the ring room. Occupational medicine measured his hearing within normal limits and wrote subjective complaint in a tone that implies exaggeration. He stopped hearing certain birds in the morning. Another tech, the one who felt the elevator pressure when the coils held resonance, began waking at 3:14 a.m. exactly, the timestamp that branded itself into logs and nerves alike. His wife said he started sleeping on the couch by choice, to keep his tossing away from her dreams. There's a spouse who remembers the day the hum followed her home. Her husband had been moved to day shifts after a documentation language review, the kind that finds a word like anti-gravity in a joke and decides it means intent. He'd stopped sleeping the night he logged a phase hold that coincided with a cold bloom. Weeks later, she found him standing in the kitchen, staring at the microwave clock as if it might move. He stopped sleeping after the hum. She wrote in a note she never sent to anyone. She taped it inside a cookbook and turned the page. Meanwhile, innocents take collateral hits. The colleague whose login overlapped during the leak night, his courtesy interview, left a smear that didn't wash. He stayed on, but his annual review carried a sentence: exercise caution in collaborative scenarios. He started eating lunch alone. His daughter's softball coach asked if he'd chaperone a tournament trip. He declined. He couldn't stand the feel of gym bleachers under fluorescent lights anymore. This was the moment everything changed for the engineer who walked the thumb drive out. The move to remote documentation came with a clause forbidding contact with non-cleared media entities. He hadn't contacted us, not directly. Fear made the clause bigger than it was. He took long drives to nowhere and practiced telling his daughter he couldn't come to parent night without saying why. He kept the 1954 memo folded in his wallet until the crease wore through the paper, then tucked the pieces into a library book and returned it to a branch he'd never visited. Families uproot without calling it that. A range electrician who kept a drawer of toasted surge protectors got offered a transfer to a base 3 states away with a stipend too good to refuse. He took it. His wife started over at a job that paid less by a third. Their son left a team he loved and sat in a new cafeteria where nobody knew which table was safe. The electrician told himself it was a better climate. He told his therapist he missed the smell of dust where the desert meets the hangar, even if it fried his tools. Not all costs are imposed. Some are chosen. A sonar operator who typed "target moved like it wasn't pushing water" asked for shore duty because sleep stopped listing him as a client. He gave up a promotion track to sit in a windowed office where he wrote training modules for people who would never see what he saw. He bought a bike. He rode before dawn when the world is loud enough with birds to drown out blue tags that live in your head. Complications make it messy. Not everyone who moved or quit or got sick did so because of a ring. Life layers coincidences until causality is a fog. But patterns repeat where they shouldn't. Badge access shrinks for those who ask the exact questions the leak answers. Medical notes say deferred where numbers should be. Performance plans grow bullet points about adherence to narrative guidance. A corporate culture learns to flinch when someone says, "What if we told them?" and trains itself to say, "We can't." Meanwhile, leaks persist because conscience outruns fear in some people the way a hum outruns language. A machinist refused a bonus tied to a non-compete and took a job building wind turbine housings instead. A grad student on a contractor fellowship printed a public patent by a Navy researcher and slid it into a professor's mailbox with a sticky note. If this is nonsense, debunk it. If it's not, teach it. A retired range manager sent a single photo, nothing sensitive, just a scuffed floor marked with tape in a circle, and wrote, "We used to call this the line. Don't cross it." Human moments cut the official story to ribbons. A guard who smiles too long. A janitor who wears earplugs because the air presses when the lights dim. A birthday card with "You saw nothing, celebrate anyway." A coin taped to a log. A hand that taps a wrist when the topic is time. These are the costs that never make memos because memos don't have fields for regret. Impact is a chilling effect that works until it doesn't. Doors close. People settle. Nightmares fade to static. Then a storm knocks out power in a county that could have used a gridless pod, or a pilot retires and tells his story at a bar where a young tech hears the word stillness and recognizes it. The seal holds until tiny leaks accumulate into a pressure you can't scold into silence. The price isn't paid only by those inside. It's paid by the rest of us in inventions that arrive late, in labs that teach around absences, in summers that run hotter while a cold halo hums behind a wall. Suppression buys time for control. It sells time off the lives of people who carried the hum home and couldn't sleep it away. And yet, even there, the hum moves. A spouse keeps a note in a cookbook. A child asks why dad doesn't ride the motorcycle anymore and hears, "The weather's off," and grows up to study weather. An engineer folds a memo until it becomes a talisman, then lets it go. Fear writes policy. Conscience writes leaks. The cost of truth is paid in small, human installments until someone says the word out and means it. What it means if Aurora is real. Bring it out of the hangar and into a life you recognize. If the ring hums the way the files say it does, the first change isn't a flying saucer over your house. It's a plug that doesn't need a wall. A drive that turns inertia down isn't only for craft. It's control loop couples to fields that sip power where combustion gulps. Gridless pods show up first on the margins. Field hospitals that don't black out when storms rip lines. Wildfire camps that run cold lights and clean air without a diesel cough. Villages at the end of long bad roads that stop waiting for tankers. Stakes get personal fast. Energy independence isn't just for nations, it's for blocks, schools, clinics, farms. The cold halo that hugs a ring in a desert bay can be tuned for heat pumps that don't wheeze in summer and chillers that don't poison wells. Refrigerated trucks stop burning fuel idling in lines. Food losses shrink. If you've ever thrown out a week of groceries after an outage, you know exactly what that means. Now widen that to a city. Transport bends next. If a field can ease inertia enough to make right angles feel like a shrug, travel's bottleneck isn't thrust, it's control. Silent craft lift from rooftops without rotor slap. Cross a state before your coffee cools, and settle without a plume. Highways stop deciding where people live. Commutes stop deciding who gets time with their kids. Freight moves at times people sleep because the sky won't wake neighborhoods. Ports and rail yards stop owning the map. That doesn't just change schedules, it changes property lines, budgets, where a life can happen. Climate stops being a sermon and starts being a plan. If propulsion doesn't hinge on combustion, emissions curves kink. Not overnight. Transition always drags its feet and trips on vested interests. But a drive that barely warms the air around it doesn't write smoke into the sky. Every truck that stops burning, every ship that stops coughing, every generator that hums cold is heat you don't trap. The choice stops being sacrifice versus denial and becomes timing versus courage. Geopolitics, sure. Choke points where tankers crawl thin into relics. Countries that sell oil sell less, then sell promises instead. Alliances built on refueling rights get awkward. Fleets that can cross an ocean without staging don't ask for basing the same way. A military that can hover in silence decides differently about what presence means. That scares some and relieves others. It shortens wars that never start and lengthens debates that never end. Control fights back when markets shift. It always has. Everyday life absorbs it the way it absorbs every disruptive thing. Quietly at first, then all at once. You don't notice the first time your ambulance arrives faster, because it cut lines no one can cut. You do notice the second time when you realize a siren didn't scream, because the craft didn't need it. Rooflines learn a new silhouette. Zoning boards argue about landing corridors the way they once argued about satellite dishes. Kids grow up under skies that purr instead of roar and think that's normal. There's a darker mirror. A machine that eases inertia makes sabotage easier if you don't build guardrails. Silent approaches aren't just for rescues. Borders blur when noise can't carry far enough to warn. Smuggling gets clever. Policing gets jumpy. Surveillance learns to listen to fields, not engines. The same cold pods that keep insulin safe in a flood can keep contraband fresh in a van you can't hear. That isn't a reason to bury the math. It's a reason to publish standards before fear writes them for you. Meanwhile, materials science gets a century of work in a decade. If the layered stack is as touchy and powerful as the files suggest, every lab that grows films learns new tricks. Better batteries because interfaces behave, better sensors because anisotropy isn't a curse, better medical imaging because fields can be shaped like sculpture. The spillover from any real propulsion leap is always bigger than the leap. Fly-by-wire births fly-by-mind. Space programs give you weather and cameras in your pocket. The ring, if real, gives you a toolbox that doesn't care about wings. You can't unspool this without talking about work. Jobs anchored to combustion tilt. Refineries that employ towns retool, or they hollow out. Truckers learn a new cockpit, or they watch silence pass them. Unions fight extinction and negotiate retraining. Good policy treats them like the people who carried a century of fuel on their backs, not like collateral. Bad policy waves a flag and lets them fall. The drive makes the choice obvious and still hard. Now the human angle that haunts the engineer's notebook. Give it to the kids who will fix our mess. He didn't write a manifest. He wrote a plea. The kids he means aren't abstract. They're the ones soldering cheap kits on kitchen tables, the ones at community colleges who can build a Coil controller cleaner than a contractor because they don't have to fill out a timesheet. They're the ones who grew up in smoke and don't want their children to. They don't need access to Bay 3. They need a method you can do without a guard at the door. History warns us exactly how this goes when control wins the first round. Radio got licensed after it got weird. Nuclear physics got classified after it got powerful. The web got sold after it got ubiquitous. The pattern isn't a reason to give up. It's a reason to get the sequencing right. Openness with guardrails, safety with sandboxes, licenses that protect people, not markets. You can write rules now that keep kitchen table labs from cooking their brains, and still let them see what a phase step means in their hands. If Aurora is real, it isn't just a craft. It's an argument about who we are when we can move without burning. Do we build a better ambulance first or a quieter bomber? Do we open source control loops with protections or lock them in racks that hum behind a fence? Do we let a few owners keep the hum to themselves because they learned first? Or do we admit they learned on roads we all paved and ask them to share? There's no clean answer that satisfies every fear. There is a better answer than silence. Get this, human nature will split down the usual lines. Some will say, not yet, too dangerous. Some will shout, now or don't bother. The leak narrows doubt to a sliver you can measure, which means not yet turns into how and when. The responsible path isn't to wait for perfect proof. It's to start building the world that can handle it. Transparent tests, published negative results, public funding that isn't afraid of looking foolish, and a promise that the first beneficiaries aren't the ones who need it least. There's one last unresolved variable tying 1954 to now. A name that keeps surfacing when the alloy turns up and the logs go blue. That lineage tells you continuity kept a flame alive in rooms that lock. If Aurora is real, lineage can either guard it or hand it off. The meaning sits in that handoff. Turn down inertia, and you can turn down the fear that keeps progress locked away. Kids don't need legends. They need schematics and a safe bench. And they need someone to say out loud that the hum can leave the hangar and come home. The name that connects decades. It kept showing up where the story bent. Not loudly, never in headlines, just tucked in CC lists, patent assignees, and committee minutes where only the patient look. Stakes were simple: continuity of knowledge versus institutional amnesia. If one thread ran from sample 72B to Hermes to Ceruan, it meant the flame didn't just survive, it was tended. We traced it the way you trace anything that isn't meant to be obvious, through the paper that pretends it's about something else. In 1954, a metallurgical note on 72B included a carbon copy list with initials that look like dust today. One surname sits there, third position, paired with a single letter first name. 30 years later, a thin film deposition patent focused on high diamagnetic composites lists a co-inventor with the same last name and a different first initial, affiliated with a Midwest lab that later became the defense contractor's materials arm. In 2015, a white paper circulated in a closed ocean sensing working group. Topic: Signal persistence in stratified saline layers. and a consultant on the byline wore that same surname again. Different first names, same family. The decades spelled a lineage the programs never admitted existed. Action became a map of rooms. The earliest reference lives in a Wright-Patterson memo archive, Materials Division, Exotic, stamped in the blunt font of the era. Our name sits in the CC list next to interface characterization, the polite phrase for we don't know why it behaves. We jump to the 199s and land in a conference program, with drawn abstract on magnesium bismuth interface stability. The corresponding author is our surname with a middle initial. He doesn't present. The abstract vanishes. 3 weeks later, that contractor's plant adds a clean room they pretend is for brackets. A decade and a half after that, ocean data starts being filtered like someone learned patience from metals. Evidence piled in the places that don't stage theater, meeting minutes, sign-in sheets, and review memos. A Senate staff briefing from the late 90s records a private demonstration of layered interface repeatability for 2 committee aides, requested by a doctor with our name who never appears in the hearing's public transcript. An advisory board roster from the early 200s lists the same surname on a subcommittee for non-stationary resonance tracking. The minutes read dry, but the questions crackle. Phase stability in heterogeneous medium? Cross-program perm linkage? Nobody writes like that unless they've touched both coil timing and ocean noise. Human moments came out sideways. We found an obituary clipped from a small town. Paper, 2 columns wide, the kind you read when you know the family and bring a casserole. It said he'd worked in materials, loved fishing, and mentored young engineers. The funeral photo shows a closed casket and a front row of people who don't look like they cry often, staring at a floor that must have told them secrets. Nobody spoke about the real work because the real work wasn't fit for church. After the service, a man we later learned was a colleague handed the widow an unmarked envelope and said, "For the scholarship." She didn't open it there. A year later, a prize for interface studies appeared at a local college, named for the family, funded by a donor who chose anonymity. The call for entries used a phrase we'd seen in a contractor training deck, layered anisotropy. Meanwhile, the name threaded through patents without ever being the first listed inventor, the safe second, the shepherd. In one deposition technique filing, the claims cite control of micron-scale lamination under low-temperature cycling. The assignee is the company we'd already trailed from shells to hangars. In a DSP patent, the abstract mentions locking under saline-driven variability, a phrase that only makes sense if you've watched Ceruan lose its footing in rough water. Our surname is there, again, this time with a junior suffix. The parent retires. The child chairs a standards committee with a title about sensors, and a job that reads like a cover. Teach the world to listen while you tune the hum. This was the moment everything changed for the timeline. We found a ghost-written report, committee letterhead, bland title, on grid resiliency via distributed storage. It shouldn't touch our story. It does. A footnote cites field-induced mass attenuation studies in context of shock protection for infrastructure. The attributed author is a policy analyst. The draft metadata says the file was last edited by our surname. The editor's note on the margin reads, "Strip jargon, leave concept." That's someone who knows exactly how far to push in daylight. Complications tried to erase as we approached. Some records are gone, purged by policy or time or boredom. A university archive lists a lecture on magnetostructural coupling, given by a visiting scientist with our name. The tape is missing, the transcript is lost in transfer. A contractor's internal newsletter once ran a 1-paragraph retirement note for a mentor who bridged labs and seas. The PDF exists. The embedded image is blank. The alt text reads, "Error, placeholder." Gaps like that look accidental. Too many, and they ring like intent. Impact lands in continuity that institutions claim and rarely earn. The lineage kept the flame, not as a conspiracy of blood, but as a relay, knowledge passed kitchen table style. What to try when a layer delaminates. What to say in a meeting when a general asks a question he shouldn't know to ask. Which acronym buys you a year and which buys you a day. The leak blows the door because it lets the public see a pattern insiders pretended was coincidence. A name that kept appearing in the margins steps forward as the spine. Human cost pressed close again. The youngest bearer of the surname declined to speak on record and asked us to stop saying the family name aloud. We agreed. He did share one thing off tape, a story about a summer he was 12, visiting a lab where magnets misbehaved and a coffee cup skittered when it shouldn't. He didn't see the sample. He saw faces that had. He said, they called it an alloy. They meant an inheritance. Then he asked us not to quote him. We just did without the name. Meaning sits where genealogy meets intent. The work moved because people decided it mattered more than job titles. That can guard a secret too long, and it can keep a breakthrough lit through decades when the math is unfashionable. Some records are gone. What remains is enough to say the line didn't break. It curved through metal, through water, through air, and arrived here with room to breathe. The leak didn't prove the machine, but it crushed coincidence until doubt feels like denial. If we can nudge inertia, we can nudge the fear that keeps good work in the dark. Subscribe if you're ready for the next chapter, where we follow the contractor's money trail and publish our safer replication protocol. Watch our deep dive on the ocean signatures that fed Ceruan. It's the missing piece the desert logs can't show.